Well, good morning. That was a great time of worship. God is mighty. For those who don't know me, I'm Ryan Lenerz, and I'm a team pastor here at Ashworth. And maybe, like some of you, my wife and I, we've now built a garden in our backyard. Raise your hand if you're a gardener at all. Do we have a few gardeners? Not so many. I know that second service, it's all going to be like arms in the air. Okay, so you're going to learn with me what I've learned from gardening. So when we built our garden, my wife, it started out, it was very, very tiny. It got bigger each year until finally I'm like, okay, I'm going to put some permanent structure in place so she can't make it bigger next year. But we build this garden, and when we do it, we have this idea in our mind that this garden is going to provide us this abundance of fresh fruit and vegetables and a harvest, like our dinner salads we're going to go pick from the garden, and it's going to be beautiful and ripe and lush and red and green and all these colors overflowing. And we have an idea, probably something a bit like this, of what our gardens are going to look like. It's just gorgeous. Unfortunately, if you've gardened at all, or if you go down to the Faith and Grace garden, you might see that's not what most of our gardens look like. No, when we till the soil and when we add the fertilizer and we water it and we make sure it gets plenty of sun, it becomes the perfect growing conditions, not just for our beloved fruits and vegetables, but also for weeds. And so at the Lenerz home, our garden actually looks just like this as of Friday morning. It's an okay garden. We've got our tomatoes and our peppers and the broccoli and the cucumbers, and all those things are growing. Somehow we have a lone sunflower in the middle of our garden that must have gotten there from a bird of some sort, and we're like, it's pretty, so we left it. But in the middle of all those plants, we have the grass that's growing through the paths. Grass is growing up around all the tomato plants. We have a few plants that we weren't sure, is that plant or is that weed? So we just let it grow, and now it's the same height, and we're still not totally sure. And so we've just got a bit of a mess, and I blame the whole thing on Adam. First of all, we've got to go back to Adam, the one who made the first big mistake in the Garden of Eden. It is his fault. Part of the fall was weeds. And we know that because God's curse on Adam was that by the sweat of your brow, you will eat food. And if you've ever tried to weed an entire garden, you know that is incredibly sweaty work. It is hot, the sun comes up, it's muggy. Like, I think the Garden of Eden probably looked like the first picture. And after sin, it looked a lot more like our picture. Like, everything just got tougher. So I blame it on him. I know that gardening is sweaty work because I started trying to weed our garden once. I quit rather quickly. But here's why I gave up. Getting rid of the weeds isn't just about the hard work of being on your knees and weeding. You have to actually also know what's weed and what's plant. So my wife's weeding, and she's like, no, Ryan, you're helping me weed. I'm like, okay. So I go in, and she's like, go weed over there, over there. So I go over there. And I start pulling up what looks like weeds. And she's like, why are you pulling up all the broccoli? And I'm like, because I don't know what I'm doing. So no weeds are taken up. 3 pieces of broccoli are out of the ground. She moves me. She says, okay, get out of the veggie garden. We've got a strip along the fence. It's our berries. We've got some strawberries. Strawberries are short. The grass at that time was about that tall. This is easy. I can just grab the grass from the top. Yoink, 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 it's all out. Except for the grass grows its roots wide. And as I pull out the first piece of grass, it grabs the strawberry right next to it where the roots had intertwined. And boom, I've got grass and I've got strawberry. I've got weed and I've got fruit, both intertwined and both pulled out. So that's when I quit weeding. I said, I'm done. And in preparing for this week's message, I realized it's actually biblical to let your weeds grow up with your garden. And while that may not be the purpose of where this message actually goes, it made me feel a lot better for a fleeting moment. So today we're going to be looking at another parable that Jesus told in Matthew chapter 13, verse 24. It's known right now in most our Bibles as the wheat and the weeds. And it's a parable that Jesus tells of a farmer sowing seed in his field. And if that sounds familiar, it's because 2 weeks ago, Pastor Brent stood up here and preached a sermon about a farmer sowing seeds in a field, except that parable looked specifically at that seed that landed on 4 different types of soil. And the parable Jesus tells right here in the same chapter, it's actually the story immediately following that parable of the 4 types of soil, is a farmer and sowing seed and somebody else sowing a second type of seed and 2 different plants growing up. So 2 different seeds and 2 different plants are the premise of this parable. And some of you may be a little more familiar with this story by the familiar name from the King James translation of the wheat and the tares. But since nobody knows what a tare is in America anymore, they changed that word in most of our modern Bibles to the wheat and the weeds. And so let me read this parable to you right now from Matthew chapter 13, verse 24 through 30. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like, remember all these parables are describing the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Then where did all the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, 'First collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn.'" So here's why tares is actually a better translation, if we actually knew what it meant, than weeds. Because the Greek used here is specifically talking about a plant known as darnel, which would have in Old English been called the tares. Farmers would have known that's what a tare was. But it's known as darnel, and it looks just like wheat when it's growing up. And the 2 plants, they grow, and when they're green, they look exactly the same. But as they start to grow heads, you can see they change. And so the 2 plants don't actually look different until they sprout their heads, like it tells us in the parable. The wheat turning to golden, a big, full head, full of seeds, full of food that we all eat. The darnel, also known as poison darnel, so that tells us a little bit about what it's good for, nothing, grows this black head. It grows these black seeds, and they're much fewer and further between. They're not edible to anybody else. They're a waste. And that's why when the servants, they really didn't understand that any different seed had been sown until after the seeds sprouted. And so the servants are confused when they see these 2 different types of plants in the field. And they question the farmer. Maybe he made a mistake. Maybe he had bad seed. Maybe he spread some good, some bad. And they're like, maybe it's his fault. But the farmer knew that wasn't the case. And he immediately pointed to the presence of an enemy. And we might look at that and say, wow, that's kind of interesting that he supernaturally somehow knew that an enemy had come and sown the bad seed in his field. But I thought it was fascinating in reading today, or this week, I found that there is actually a Roman law against sowing darnel seed in the midst of a wheat field as an act of revenge. It was so common in that day and age that they had made a law against it because people were doing this on purpose. So that's why the owner would have known, no, somebody did this on purpose. This wasn't me sowing bad seed. And it's at this point then that the servants start thinking how I would think. They see all the weeds, and like me, they want to get rid of it. They're like, no, we want a field of wheat. We don't need the weeds. Let's just go and get it out of here. Let's uproot it. Now we can identify what's what, and let's get it out of here. But the master says, no, not yet. Wait. He knew what I discovered the hard way with those strawberries, that if they started weeding the field right then and there, they were going to accidentally uproot some of the wheat with the tares, with the darnel. So they planned to wait until the time of harvest. And then they would cut down the wheat and they would cut down the tares. And at the end of the season, they would separate the 2. The darnel would be burned up while the wheat was stored in the master's barns. And now this parable, like all parables, is meant to instruct us. It's not just to teach us about gardening and let your weeds grow up. And some of it, when you read it, you probably see where this is going. It's kind of clear to understand, but some of it isn't. Some of it leaves us with a lot of questions. And as with the longer parables that have more going on inside, this teaches us actually a lot more than just one point. So let's begin to unpack this story with Jesus as our guide, because fortunately, this is one of the parables where we have recorded for us Jesus' explanation of the parable. So I think that we should start there and trying to understand what he's teaching here. So let's look in Matthew, skip ahead to verses 37 through 39. He begins by saying, he answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man." So the master or the farmer here, the one who's sowing the good seed, it's his property. He is the Son of Man. And what Jesus is doing here, everybody knows he's talking about himself. But he's using the title, the Son of Man, which was an Old Testament title used to refer to the Messiah that all the Jews were waiting for. This is another one of those places in the Bible where Jesus is basically saying, look, I am the one that you have been expecting. And with this parable, what's going to happen might not look like what you're expecting, but I am the one that you have been waiting for. He continues, the field is the world. So the field is the entire world, and some people at points have thought that this parable was only about the church, and that the field is the church, and that in this church, some of you are wheat and some of you are tares, and we don't know which ones are which. And no, Jesus is real clear here. This is the entire world, all people on the face of this earth. And the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. It's the followers of Jesus. The weeds are the people of the evil one. They're the people who believe the lies of the devil, and the enemy who sows them is the devil, he says. And what's really fascinating here is we have to look and understand that Jesus is very clear that the devil is the enemy of the Son of Man. And he's saying the devil is a very real person, personified, who is the enemy of everything that I'm trying to do with this kingdom on earth. This is a real singular being who actually exists, who is trying to disrupt everything that I'm trying to do here. As I'm trying to spread good seed to the entire world, this gospel that I have come to save, the enemy is coming along behind me, spreading all these messages, all these lies for you to believe, whichever one you want to grasp onto, that takes you away from the message that I'm spreading. And finally, the harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are the angels. So the end of the age here, the harvest, is this final judgment that Jesus, through many different places in the Gospels, he talks about it. We see it in the Old Testament. We see it in the New Testament. This one day coming judgment that we have yet to experience. And now with all these connections established, Jesus describes the meaning of the parable in the next 3 verses. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, we see weeds and we want to condemn it. We see people who are living a life that is completely contrary to how they should be living, and we feel like it's my job to tell them, you can't do that. You can't live that way. That's a sin. God didn't make you that way. And we go on, and we see people in our life, and we put on this title of harvester. We grab the sickle, and we're going to knock them down, condemn them for their sin. And guess what? That's not our role. Jesus is the judge. The angels are the harvesters. Let's share love. Let's be kindness. Let's be warmth to everybody around. Let's spread that competing message while the world is trying to say, you can do this on your own. You can earn your salvation. You can make up your own a la carte beliefs, and that's all cool. Let's sow seed that says, no, Jesus came to do it all for you. Let's not be the harvesters. Let's join in the sowing. Does that make sense? I think that's our role in this parable, to join him in that. And the final point we have to make here is each one of us has a choice. Ultimately, in this parable, there are 2 kinds of seed. There are 2 kinds of plants that grow up to have 2 very different endings. Like it or not, Jesus is clear that people either receive the seed of the gospel and sprout into followers of Jesus, sons and daughters of God, or they receive the seeds of the devil, the lies that you can help yourself, you can earn your way to heaven, like I said, Maybe it's a lie that you'll never be good enough, so don't bother trying. Maybe it's the lie that there is no judgment, so don't worry about it. There is no God, so make life whatever it is you want to make life to be. There's all sorts of lies that this culture is spreading to us, that the devil has been sowing all across this world. And people believe those, and you have a choice. Are you going to believe the gospel of Jesus, that we are saved by faith, and that ultimately we have the opportunity to walk with God and to join him for all eternity? Or are you going to believe something else? Because Jesus says we're all going to be one plant or the other. And you have to decide, do you believe that? Do you trust what the Bible is teaching us here? Do you trust what I'm telling you from up front? Because ultimately, Jesus is very clear that judgment is imminent. So what are you ultimately trusting that judgment to? When you think about your eternity, are you basing your eternity on how you think it should go and how you think it should work and how you think you've been a good enough person? Or are you basing your eternity on something that has actual proof and signs to back it up, of a God who died for us and rose to new life and appeared to over 500 people, who changed the entire Mediterranean world, completely transformed Rome, and has been spread throughout the entire world ever since? Because when I look at that storyline, I say, yeah, I believe there's some truth in here, or none of that would have happened. But if I believe that the truth is in here, that Jesus is truly our Savior, then I have to believe what he says, that there are two messages we can grab, and there are two eternities that we can receive. And we have to be prepared for either one of those when we walk out of here. We have two options at the end. We can either be burned up in the furnace, or we can be burned brightly like the sun in glory in God's presence. And how are you going to respond to that today? If today you're making that decision for the first time, you're saying, you know what? I need to decide for myself. Then I encourage you, tell somebody next to you, like during the next song, say, I need to decide to follow Jesus today. I can't wait. I know judgment is coming, and I want to be counted among the wheat. I want to be gathered into the master's barns. I want to spend eternity with my God. Make that decision. Because whether we like the concept of judgment or not isn't the issue. Jesus simply tells us it's happening. So the issue is, are we ready? And for some of us, this maybe gives you incredible hope. Hope for salvation and rescue from this broken world and this weary body. And for others, perhaps this strikes a little bit of fear in your heart, fear that you're not ready. And if that's you, then I encourage you today, make yourself ready. Choose this day who you will serve. For those of us who have chosen to follow Jesus, today we wait for his kingdom to fully come. We wait for God to bring his good and gracious judgment in the perfect time. And we sit, and like the mustard seed and like the yeast in this parable, we simply wait for the kingdom of God to advance and to grow, and for more and more wheat to grow into this beautiful, bountiful harvest that God's going to bring home. And we trust that he knows what's best for this world and for each and every one of us. And that's why he's waiting. That's why he's graciously giving us every new day. And while we wait for his perfect timing, we don't join in trying to pull out the weeds, in judging sinners, but we join in scattering the seed. That's our role. We join in helping to grow as many lives transformed by the good news of Jesus as possible. And we trust the Master, Jesus Christ, to bring us home in the final harvest. Will you bow your heads with me as we pray?